couple of days after the Italian Grand Prix, headlines began circulating among the financial press that trouble was brewing on the European money markets following a devaluation of the Italian lira. The president of the German Bundesbank had told the Wall Street Journal that a comprehensive realignment would have to occur, which, intended as a statement of fact rather than intent, but triggered a massive sell-off of sterling by traders overnight. According to the rules of the EU-wide exchange rate mechanism, the Bank of England was obliged to accept any offers to sell pounds, but could only do so during the trading day, so when the markets opened on Wednesday, all the orders went through together, and despite the attempts by both the Bank of England and the Chancellor Norman Lamont to shore up the currency, there was a run on the pound, and by the evening Britain was forced to withdraw from the ERM, regarded as a national humiliation by many, particularly for the recently re-elected Conservative Party, who are traditionally regarded as the party of sound economic management. A new poll a few weeks after Black Wednesday showed support for the Conservatives had collapsed from 43% to 29%. 4 days later, France went to the polls to vote on whether or not the country should ratify the Treaty of Maastricht. Following a vote against by Denmark and a cautious vote in favour by Ireland, the French was the third and last planned referendum on the subject and by far the largest in terms of the size of the country. Both main parties in France, the centre-left Socialist Party and the centre-right Union for French Democracy, supported the treaty, as did Jacques Chirac, mayor of Paris and head of the Gaullist conservative Rally for the Republic. However, many of the rally's supporters were more opposed and were joined in an unlikely alliance by many on the far left, who saw the European project as a neoliberal project, and the far right, who disagreed with the principle of integration and free movement. The result was incredibly close, 51.05% in favour against 48.95% against, on a turnout of just under 70%. It became known as the Petit Oui, the little yes. Dr. Mae Jemison became the first African-American woman to travel into space as a mission specialist aboard the Space Shuttle Endeavour 5 years after beginning her astronaut training. A medical doctor and chemical engineer, she was on board to conduct experiments in microgravity on a number of different life science subjects. She was joined on board by the first official Japanese astronaut, Mamoru Mori, a representative of the Japanese Space Agency who had co-developed the orbital lab being used. Official Japanese astronaut because journalist Toyohiro Akiyama had taken a commercial spaceflight to the Soviet Mir station in August 1990. Also on board the Endeavour were the only married couple ever to fly together on the shuttle. Mission specialists Mark Lee and Jan Davis had somehow forgotten to mention they were married because having couples fly the same mission was against NASA policy, but by the time it came out, things were far too advanced to change plans. Asked the obvious question by journalists, Davis denied that they'd be getting up to anything intimate on board. In Portugal, news had finally been broken of 1992's worst-kept secret in Formula One, that Alain Prost would be a Williams driver in 1993. He was naturally immediately installed as the bookies' favourite to win his fourth world title, and would reunite with Renault some 9 years after his acrimonious split with La Régie following the 1983 season. Needless to say, Ayrton Senna had not taken the news with his usual cheerful bonhomie, calling Prost a coward again, and saying that he had a right to drive for Williams and that the decision should lie with Frank, not with Alain, as to who occupied the car, referring of course to the still unconfirmed but widely accepted idea that Prost's contract included a clause specifically barring the team from hiring his old rival. Alain, as well he might, having won the great prize, simply shrugged and called Senna effectively a bad loser and a spoiled child. The French press took his side, while much of the British press sided with Alain. It was widely felt, though, that Frank Williams had overplayed his hand, trying to game 3 drivers against each other to get the best 2, and ended up with only one of them. Who would take up the other seat remained an open question. Riccardo Patrese had felt he needed to make a move early on the assumption that he would be bounced out of his seat, but was now offered a contract extension despite having already signed terms with Benetton. Alternatively, Martin Brundle looked like he was going to be available and had driven for the team once before, though other rumours linked him with Ligier. Nigel Mansell, meanwhile, had confirmed that he had signed a deal with the front-running Newman Haas team in IndyCar racing and would take Michael Andretti's place in 1993. F1 veteran and current IndyCar star Emerson Fittipaldi was also at Estoril at the behest of Marlborough, ostensibly to promote the idea of an F1 race in New York and support his nephew Christian, but also to have a quiet word with Ayrton Senna and see if he would like to take his rivalry with Mansell across the Atlantic too. Ayrton certainly had a lot to think about, with much depending on the situation with McLaren's engine supply. News of the talks with Ligier had been leaked. Guy blamed Alain Prost for trying to scupper a deal that might see McLaren have an equal engine, and the veteran team owner was coming under pressure from the French government to hand over the reins. The team was heavily subsidised by the French state, not least through the state-owned Gitane tobacco brand, and the consistently disappointing results were getting questions asked in the highest circles. Driver Thierry Boutsen was certainly doubtful for next year, having fallen out with both Guy and Eric Comas, as well as being deeply demoralised by having never scored a point for the team in nearly 2 years. More pieces were falling into place around the paddock too, with Scuderia Italia announcing that their Lola-built cars for 1993 would be driven by young Italian Luca Badoer, while both current drivers were out. JJ Leto to Sauber and Pierluigi Martini let go after some pretty dismal performances. Alboreto was also likely to be out of the door at footwork, so a possible recruit to partner Badoer, while Jackie Oliver was also apparently trying to bring back former Arrows driver and 1992 sports car champion Derek Warwick. And Eddie Jordan would also say goodbye to his current pairing and had hired a young Brazilian, Rubens Barrichello, for next year. And as feared, the Fondmetal team had not made the trip to Portugal, Gabriele Rumi having failed to find an investor. With no buyer either, the team that Enzo Arzella had brought into F1 in 1980, seen the death of young driver Riccardo Paletti in 1982, and somehow husbanded through 13 seasons of thin gruel, closed its door for good. It was the third team following Brabham and Andrea Moda to depart the grid in as many races. The calendar was also looking like it might be slimmed down for next year too, with the Autopolis circuit in Japan, sponsors of the Benetton team, now bankrupt and unable to host the proposed Asian Grand Prix in the spring, and the Mexican Grand Prix also dropped after this year's fiasco. Not only was there no need for pre-qualification, but for the first time since 1987, every car would qualify for the race, with the 2 qualifying sessions just deciding the order. Nigel Mansell had had a recurrence of the hydraulic pump failure in testing at Estoril, but the Renault engineers thought they had it figured out. The pump was mounted in a different place on the RS4 engine to the older RS3, and when the new pump fuel edict was introduced, the RS4 vibrated more and shook the belt that drove the pump free. Unable to re-sight the pump on the fly, the team were instead working on trying to isolate it from the vibrations as Friday qualifying got underway. Mansell and Patrese were top of the pile on Friday, and while the McLarens improved their times on Saturday, it wasn't enough, and indeed the first 3 rows were by team. Mansell and Patrese on row 1, then Senna and Berger on row 2, and Schumacher and Brundle on row 3. Hakkinen was 7th, bumped out of 6th by a great lap from Brundle on Saturday, with Alboreto 8th and Herbert 9th. Jean Alesi could only manage 10th in the Ferrari, ahead of Boutsen. Gasho, with that uprated Lamborghini, was 13th, with the Tyrrells respectable in 12th and 15th, both ahead of Ivan Capelli, who had been told that this was his last race with Ferrari, as the team would be giving test driver Nicola Larini the car in Japan and Australia, allegedly to test the new gearbox, but most thought Capelli's spin at Monza had just been the last straw. Gianni Morbidelli with the other upgraded Lamborghini was 18th as the team learned that they would be looking for new engines next year. Karl Wendlinger began his last race for March in 22nd, just ahead of Naspetti. Modena was 24th, and Katayama and Fittipaldi brought up the rear, some 5.5 seconds off Mansell's pole time. As the grid headed off for the parade lap, 2 remained stationary. Both Suzuki and Schumacher had stalled. Schumacher managed to get going but would line up at the back, while Suzuki had to be dragged back into the pits to be restarted and would start from there. Red, green, and off they went, with the 2 Williamses neck and neck and the McLarens jostling for position behind them. Patrese had his nose ahead, but Mansell cut him off round the outside into turn 1, while Hakkinen was up to 5th and clambering all over the back of Berger's McLaren. Mansell immediately began to pull away, and Patrese was likewise easing away from Senna as they came round to the complete lap 1 of 71. Behind Senna, Berger led Hakkinen, Brundle and Alboreto, 7th again, with Alesi giving chase. Herbert had rubbed wheels with the footwork after being shoved over by Alesi and came in with damaged suspension. He went out again just in time to be lapped by Patrese and co, but the steering was too damaged and he trailed back in to retire, his 11th retirement in 14 races. By the end of lap 2, Mansell was already 4 seconds ahead of his teammate, while Schumacher, unseen, was charging up through the field, making it up to 15th by the following lap, then 14th past Leto on lap 4. While Mansell continued building a lead over Patrese, the second Williams seemed unable to properly get away from Senna, who had Berger and Hakkinen still hanging on to him, and that was the way it remained for some time. Even Schumacher's charge had been stymied at 13th place as he was stuck behind the battling Ligiers, Gachot and De Cesaris. Alesi parked it in the gravel on turn 3, lap 13. The Ferraris had both been suffering from both oversteer and understeer in different places all weekend, and evidently even Jean's talent wasn't quite enough on this occasion, his 10th retirement in 14 races. Mansell started lapping the first backmarkers, Suzuki, Fittipaldi and Katayama on lap 15, with a 10-second lead over Patrese, but a couple of laps later he encountered a knot of traffic and Patrese was able to close up to within 5 seconds before he set about the Jordans. And Mansell's lead stretched back out again as Stefano Modena repeatedly refused to let his veteran countryman past. Schumacher, meanwhile, having fought his way up past Comas, came in for new tyres, rejoining back in 15th. He was followed in the next lap by Senna, whose crew got him out 6th after a stunning sub-5 second stop. Berger's stop was only a whisker slower, which put Hakkinen up to 3rd, the Finn's first time in the top 3, though presumably it would only be until he stopped himself, but first he would go up to 2nd as Patrese stopped. A problem on the right rear kept Ricciardo stationary for nearly 20 seconds, but he still only dropped back to 5th as Brundle came in too, getting out 6th behind Patrese. Hakkinen was far enough behind Mansell that even if Nigel came in for tyres himself, the Lotus probably wouldn't get to lead a race, but it was immaterial because Mika was in for new boots himself on lap 25, rejoining between Patrese and Brundle. So with only the leader left to stop, and with a 30-second lead, it was Mansell over Senna, Berger, Patrese, Hakkinen and Brundle, with Patrese the fastest man on the track as he set about making up for the fact that he'd spent twice as long stationary as both McLarens had put together. Given Mansell had famously lost the race at Estoril last year after a botched pit stop saw his wheel fall off, he must have been hoping Williams had had their howler for the day and his own stop would be trouble-free. Lap 27 was a bad one for Gerard Larousse's boys as Gachot dropped out with no fuel pressure and Katayama copied Alesi's off at turn 3, though he was pushed out of the gravel by the marshals and got going again, depositing gravel across the track and sending the stewards into a huddle to discuss disqualification. Mansell came in for his own stop 2 laps later, a cautious but trouble-free stop getting him out still in the lead, but now by only 2 seconds from Senna, while Schumacher had made his way up to 7th and was chasing his teammate Brundle, who in turn was attacking Hakkinen for 5th. With all the tyre stops having been on the early side, the Goodyear experts had looked at the tyres and concluded that while wear had been heavier than they thought, they reckoned the second set would go the distance with the reduced fuel load and a nice line of rubber down on the track as the race reached half distance. Last year's winner, Patrese, was charging, breaking the lap record as he flew round in pursuit of Berger, and he caught the Austrian when he was held up by Katayama, while unseen behind them, Brundle had made his way past Hakkinen, and Schumacher had caught both of them as they went through the traffic themselves. Capelli's Ferrari career came to an ignominious end on lap 36, an engine failure responsible for his 11th retirement of the year. He'd been having a massive misfire most of the race, slowly dropping back until he was 19th by the time his car finally gave up the ghost. By lap 40, Patrese was right in Berger's wheel tracks, and for the next few laps he was harassing the Austrian, trying to find a way through but never quite making it past. A combination of Honda V12 power on the straights and some canny defensive driving kept Gerhard ahead. Meanwhile, still unseen, the ongoing scrap between Hakkinen and Brundle had seen Mika get back past Martin into 5th. Berger's defence was killing his tyres though, and on lap 43 he decided to pit for new ones as Patrese gathered himself for another go. At the end of that lap, Berger moved right to go into the pits, but Patrese was taken by surprise and clipped the back wheel of Berger's McLaren, launching the Williams into the air before it crashed back down and skidded along the pit wall, shedding bits everywhere. Somehow none the worse for wear, though thoroughly shaken and with a bruised knee, Patrese climbed out as Berger changed his tyres and headed back out on track as if nothing had happened. The shattered Williams was well off the racing line and could safely be left, but the accident had scattered bits all over the track and out came the stationary yellows. But Pierluigi Martini ran over a bit of carbon fibre and got a puncture. Schumacher punctured his front right and came in to pit for new ones and a new nose. Morbidelli came in with punctures in both radiator and tyre and was stationary for 2 minutes, while JJ Leto had a very lucky escape when a bit of Patrese's drive shaft speared through his front monocoque and grazed his leg. In all the excitement, Brundle had retaken 5th off Hakkinen, while Schumacher's stop and Patrese's retirement had promoted them to 4th and 5th and Michele Alboreto to 6th. In fact, Schumacher was back in again on lap 47 for the team to have another look at the damage to his car, but they decided it was okay and off he went again. And now it was Senna in, but this time just for a routine tyre stop, a smidge under 6 seconds and back out into second. Another debris-related puncture afflicted Andrea de Cesaris, while Katayama had another spin, and this time there was no recovery, and he was out, whether or not he would have been disqualified. Mansell went past, lapping fifth-placed Häkkinen, and set off after Brundle, who, possibly thinking Mansell was Patrese, spent some time vigorously defending his position before finally succumbing. Leto pulled in on lap 54, the pain from his grazed leg and the damage to his car proving too much, while Schumacher was once again making his way back up the order, taking de Cesaris for 8th and now gunning for Boutsen, who was having an intermittent engine cutout. Mansell and Senna, 30 seconds apart, were trading fastest laps, until on lap 57 Senna peeled in for his 4th set of boots for the day, thinking he had a puncture. But this time the McLaren pit work wasn't up to it. A problem on the front right and a 17-second stop put him out behind Berger, who had problems of his own, having thrown an exhaust, and it didn't look like he was going to pose much danger to the 47-second gap to Mansell. With 10 laps to go, Schumacher had got past Boutsen and was bearing down on Alboreto, who was absolutely determined not to end up 7th again, while Senna came in for his 5th set of tyres on lap 63. This time it was the left rear that held him up to the tune of 25 seconds and dropped Senna back to 4th behind Brundle. Now there were just 5 laps to go, and Senna, despite still feeling his car just wasn't right at the back, was charging again in pursuit of Brundle and the podium as the director concentrated on watching Mansell cruise to his record-breaking 9th win of the year. Senna broke the lap record in his pursuit of Brundle, now just 5 seconds behind Martin with 4 laps to go, and when the Benetton was held up behind the duelling Italians of Fittipaldi and Aspetti, Senna took his chance and went through at turn 3. And that was that. Mansell cruised home to his 30th win and Williams' 60th to break the record set by Ayrton Senna in 1988 of 8 race wins in a year. Gerhard Berger came home second and the only other man on the lead lap, with Senna 3rd, Brundle 4th, Häkkinen 5th and Alboreto 6th, and the last man only 1 lap behind. This time it was Michael Schumacher's turn to finish just outside the points in 7th, with Boutsen nursing his ailing Ligier home 8th. An understandably angry Riccardo Patrese told the media after the race that Berger had behaved like a murderer, while the Austrian for his part tried to explain what had happened and pointed out that he could hardly have put up his hand while in a high-speed corner, but professed himself simply glad that Riccardo was all right. Senna, naturally, was still spitting feathers about the Prost situation, saying in the post-race conference that he, Prost, was determined to rig the title before a wheel had turned, to which Mansell seemed to nod in agreement, but then it didn't really matter what Mansell said or didn't say at this stage. He was already looking forward to the new challenge of learning to drive in IndyCar. Mansell's win also broke another record, the first driver to reach 100 points in a season, while Senna's 3rd place put him ahead of non-scorers Schumacher and Patrese in the race for 2nd place. McLaren's double podium, meanwhile, put them likewise into 2nd ahead of Benetton, so there was still plenty to play for as the Grand Prix circus headed off for the last 2 flyaway races in Japan and Australia. The next race would be Honda's last as an engine supplier at this circuit they owned, and the Japanese firm, McLaren, and Ayrton Senna, a big star in Japan, would all be determined to make it a good one.